Okay, so this is probably going to be my most dangerous topic of late, and this is either going to put me down as one of the few that dared to go against the norm for this series, or is going to cancel this channel overnight. So which of the Dead Space games reigns supreme over the rest? Well, let's go through that, shall we? Regardless of how you may feel about my take, just know that Dead Space is one of my favorite franchises out there. You know, if you couldn't guess by the other videos on this channel. Reasons that I'm making this video could be seen that I want to clear the air of the many rankings on this platform, as the retrospectives seem to be the only creators that are willing to go through the bad, the good, and the most ugly aspects of this franchise. This video will not be including the spin-off games, not because they don't play like the rest, which in my opinion is a very bad point to even bring up in a ranking video. Not going to name any names, but I'm sure you can find the video that I'm referencing right now. But rather because I want to focus on the main entries. If you would like to know my opinion on the spin-off games, then please let me know in the comments section and I will set a challenge mark for this video within the comments. With that being said, this is just my opinion of the games and how the teams went their own way with the franchise. But if you have a different take, feel free to let me know in the comment section, and I look forward to hearing about them. But for now, sit back and relax while I go into detail about the good things and the bad things these games overall bring to the table. And for the die-hard fans out there, the nostalgia glasses are coming off for this one. Starting off our list, we will be going through the first in the franchise, the one that started the necrotic frenzy, Dead Space. I suppose the first thing that could come to mind at the very beginning would be the state of the reveal and the marketing side of things, before we get into the good, bad and ugly sides of the game. So let's take a brief walkthrough of that aspect. The reveal at E3 in 2008 was probably, in my opinion, really how to sell horror. Sure, you can talk about something scary, but you can only truly horrify people by having them explore and experience the terror firsthand. And that is exactly what Glenn had in mind. Just like what he had done with the president at EA, he would do with the unsuspecting audience lying in wait at E3. Little knowing of the terror lurking within those doors. In the presentation of Dead Space, Glenn and his team would set up a booth and allow people to play a short demo of the game. However, instead of a normal set of tables and monitors, they would present something far from this world. The booth would act like it was a part of the Ishimura itself. Upon activation, a door would slide open, allowing a steam effect to spray out. As the opening emerged, people would walk into a space meant for 1 or 2 people and would sit in a compact, dark space. And when those doors would close, it would mean that all hell was to break loose and grip the occupants with total fear and dread as they begin to play the demo for Dead Space. Many would thoroughly enjoy the experience gained from exploring this side of E3. And the game would begin building a fan base from there on out, especially when they would also sell the background story presented within the comics for Dead Space, further building the world before the game even came out. However, the world building would not stop here, as 9 weeks before Dead Space's arrival, a flash game would be presented to the public called No Known Survivors. That would present 2 scenarios and stories for the fans to piece together and make sense of the surroundings and how they contribute to the world within Dead Space. The game was presented and marketed as a horror should be, along with respecting the presentation, something that Visceral Games would struggle with in the future in deciding what a survival horror game was to be, but more on that later. The marketing side of the game was done exceptionally well, along with the infamous Twinkle Twinkle Little Star trailer being banned in certain countries for how graphic and disturbing it was at the time. so we can safely say that they did indeed make their mark. However, is the story up to scratch? Well, let's explore that, shall we? For these parts, I would recommend that you watch my timeline videos to understand the gravity of the story. However, I feel that I have spoken enough about it and the people really should know all about it by now, so I won't linger on these points for too long. The story is overall very well done, with it looking like a collage of old sci-fi horrors all stitched together. You can definitely see where their main line of inspiration comes from, with films like Aliens, Event Horizon, and The Thing taking center stage. While playing through the game, the environmental storytelling was really captivating, with corpses littering rooms, giving you the impression of a battle taking place but with the sounds echoing in the distance. The game gives you very much the feeling of whatever had occurred here could very much happen again if you linger too long in these areas. There are other moments that present you with rooms that have plenty of blood, but then again, with a lack of bodies, which further cements what you already know and fear, but again with the sounds, gives you that much more of a dreadful feeling. The game also allows you to become further immersed within the world by adding text, video and audio logs from people that are surviving or have perished within this hellish reality you find yourself within. However, it does have its poor points as well, with the nightmare being halted by either placing the marker on top of a pedestal or being destroyed, with another cliche that was brought in by Star Wars that other franchises to this day emulate, with that being destroying the spaceship ends the battle with the droids. However, in Dead Space, the developers have made sure to incorporate at least some backstory as to how the marker does this, but fails to go into further detail about how the marker produces this dormancy field, or why it does this to the outbreak. However, the story ranking I would give it is a close 9 out of 10, since there is plenty of moments that made me feel that sense of dread we love so much from these horror games, but also gave me those senses of security with dialogue and settings, only for the game to rip those away with other elements like the Nicole is dead plot twist. Even looking back at it, it was pretty obvious that something was going on, and the developers were not being at all subtle about it. But the Easter egg of taking the first letter of all of the chapters and then spelling them out really creeped me out, giving me more of a horrified and disturbed feeling, especially when you dive into the lore the game presents you with, that I only feel when watching stuff like The Human Centipede, that stays with me long after I have turned off the game or the film, and really made me think about it over and over again, which is a great reaction to achieve from a horror title, whether that be in a movie or a game or even a book. However, I think we have talked enough about the story and we should move on to something more innovative. What makes a good game isn't just the story, but the ambience as well, as the ambience will make it feel more real and grounded, and the music is what makes you feel it. The game utilizes a mix between ambience and music to try and spook the player way before seeing the necromorphs. The game's audio is infamous in all of video games, to the point of being used in schools to teach things like immersion and audio design to young adults, and how they are implemented. I do not think that even Glenn Schofield even had that level of thought when creating the game itself. The audio does an excellent job at making you feel uneasy and tense at points where you would normally feel safe in other video games, whether that would be by visiting a store or bench, or even after you jump into the level. The ambience makes the outbreak so much more of a real threat, with hearing distant screams echoing through the corridors, the necromorphs haunting the ventilation system all the way to the machinery, or the sounds of Isaac breathing, changing to match the situation. The music in the game is no different, as the developers even would say that they had implemented an audio system that continues to haunt the player, giving them the feeling something is going to happen based on what the player is doing. Standing still will cause the game to play the audio at an ambient level, but walking continues this, but ramps up the creepiness level. However, running will ramp it up to the point of feeling like something is about to crash through the ceiling and give chase. In horror, audio is crucial, and I feel it's something that is very glossed over in horror films and games nowadays, which seems to be a culture of jump scare horror now. Going into the music side of the audio, the music will change the situation of what is going on. Playing an overall goofy chain will change the overall horror setting into one of comedy, making the player laugh at the horror, like as seen as a remedy for Amnesia: The Dark Descent, for getting past the monster sections, by playing the fire sale song from Black Ops Zombies. However, if a creeping and slow music is played, like for instance if we were to look at Halo 2 for a moment, in the first cutscene the music playing gives off a feeling of something epic about to happen, or the gathering of a proud civilization. However, when playing the mission Cortana from Halo 3, you hear a very different version of the same song that symbolizes the echo of a once proud civilization being drowned out by the flood's corruption of the infested city space station. In Dead Space, the music overall gives you the feeling of dread, whether that being confronted by the terror in the form of a necromorph, or by situations unfolding before your eyes, and degrading as the story progresses. Take the opening for instance. It gives me a sort of wonder and mystery about what is happening within this part of the story, like being a part of an investigation team, which heavily relates to the setting of that opening cutscene. However, looking at the revelation of Nicole, the song Welcome to the USG Ishimura is played again, but this time reprised to match a sadder theme, since this is the moment that Isaac comes to terms with Nicole's death. One thing that the game does well with music is something that Halo Combat Evolved had done pretty well too, which is the panic theme, which is what I call pieces of music that installs panic into the player when heard. In Halo, you would hear this when being confronted by the Flood with the song Devil's Monsters, giving you the feeling of coming across something deadly and ancient that should have been left very much alone, that is now unleashed upon the world once again. In Dead Space with the song I've Got You Devolving Under My Skin, which appears mostly in later moments of the game, when being presented with the divider forms, which again relates to how the player is going to relate to them when in combat. The zero gravity areas are by far the most interesting in the entire game for the sheer soundscape of them, with not a lot of sound being played other than this low drone being played in the background. Isaac's breathing and other functions such as footsteps and kinesis can be heard, but sound muffled like you are underwater, which only adds to the immersion, which is something that the game gets just right. Dead Space brings something new to the third-player dynamic that other horror games, or hell, even normal third-person games, don't even do, which is the rig system. Sure enough, Redwood Studios could have put all of the necessary information on the screen in the top left or right or even in the bottom. However, Glenn wanted to create something truly immersive, so instead, the team thought of putting everything you need to know on the character's back, with that being the innovation of health and stasis. See, most games from that time would normally have your health stuck to the top, left, right, or bottom of the screen, which would be the standard for all HUD systems, and still continues to progress to this day, with other games turning you into a cheap Wolverine or Deadpool knockoff, minus the comedic aspect, of course. Dead Space has characters throughout the story fitted with this rig system, unless you're this special type of character over here. Yeah, we really don't need to talk about her. Everyone in this world has their health and stasis fitted to their back, not just for their own convenience or the convenience of the player, but to grant more immersion into the game itself and the world it's based in. The rig system also comes with the holographic system to look at other pieces of information crucial to a survival horror game that works in real time, rather than having to pause every time you want to look at your inventory, granting the player a state of safety. The inventory journal, logs, and map opens up in real time, where anything could happen to you, so best to do so while traveling through elevators. The combat in this game also has a unique spin on things in many horror games from this time. Headshots or body shots were the way to defeat these enemies. However, in this game, the necromorphs are designed in a way to eliminate this standard trope from the gameplay, being the most effective way to kill these monsters being the dismemberment system, as shooting a slasher in the head will cause it to start swinging its blades left and right in an attempt to kill anything nearby, making it go from precise attacks to frantic ones, much like another sci-fi enemy I could name. However, you can also use the enemy's weapons against themselves, like say for instance ripping the blade off of a slasher and throwing it back at another one can be a substitute if you are running low on ammo, and the same can be said for other objects such as saw blades and fans, which brings us to the kinesis module. The kinesis module can be used, as just said, to throw objects at enemies when low on ammo, or trying to save ammo for another fight coming up. However, the kinesis is also used for certain objects like pulling levers down and connecting conduits together, with the stasis being used in a similar fashion, like slowing down enemies and malfunctioning machinery found throughout the game. However, the stasis in Dead Space is balanced to a point, and the same with the kinesis, as in this entry the stasis slows enemies and objects down for up to 10 seconds in its base form, and it gives you 4 shots, which might seem overpowered. However, because the game is incredibly buggy and glitches out more times than I can tell in a standard playthrough, sometimes stasis will flop out, falling to the side of Isaac rather than going straight forward to where you are aiming at, or will phase through the enemies without slowing them, granting the necromorphs to enact the "no you" argument. The same can be said for kinesis, making it an annoying task to place objects into the conduits, when the kinesis will bug out from time to time. Other times, the game's bugs can be damaging to the immersion of the game itself, and in other moments can be scarier than the game attempts to be, with textures from enemies stretching and twisting in the air, and enemies can even poke their heads out at you through walls. The setting for the weapons is an interesting one, seeming as this is a mining ship, not a military ship. It would make sense that the only weapons that would be useful would be mining tools, designed for cutting, slicing, and blasting materials to pieces. However, an assault rifle type of weaponry is available, seeming as the security forces may have used that too. In some games, weapons are either crafted or found throughout the game. In Dead Space, they are inside of the store that can be purchased in the exchange of the in-game currency found throughout the ship. The stores will also allow you to purchase other tools, items, and upgrades to your suit, depending on how far you are into the game, or by picking up the schematics for these that can be found throughout the game. What the game does exceptionally well within its mechanics would be the marvel that is the zero-G areas, with a finely tuned array of details, with the way Isaac moves, to the blood coming out of the fresh corpses, coming out in blobs rather than a stream, and the way the world and its inhabitants work around these areas, including the necromorphs. However, the game would receive minor criticisms about the zero-G areas that would force a later entry to revise them. The scares in this game aren't as many because most will try to get you with as many scares as possible. With Dead Space, it will scare you or make you jump in completely different ways as previously done. So instead of giving the same lurker creeping around the corner, it will give you something different for the next time, like a giant tentacle coming from the interior workings of the ship that wants to drag you away, never to be heard from again. However, there is only really one area of this game that has effectively scared me, to the point where I couldn't even look at the screen every time it happened, and that would be with the Nicole jump scare. I don't know why, but this would freak me out every time, and it is one of my favorite features. Maybe it's cause the game makes me feel like I have defeated it, like a necromorph, only to find on closer inspection that it still has some life left in it after all. The game definitely has that creepy vibe to it that most horrors can install, but when reading the logs, including the backstories, you start to understand that these people feel more and more like real people, which makes their fate even more disturbing than before, especially with the artwork found throughout the ship, like the use of background images that many would gloss over in their first 5 playthroughs of the game. Dead Space, in my opinion, is a good game with a fleshed out story. However, the animated movie, comics, and video games do tend to overlap each other and contradict each other, but it is a story that can be thoroughly enjoyed all the same. Dead Space, in my opinion, is a classic sci-fi horror story with some action elements thrown into the mix, but it doesn't solely focus on those action side of things, and instead focuses on disturbing the player, much like what creepypastas are intended to do. However, does it mean it's better than the other two? Well, let's explore those possibilities, shall we? Getting into the sequel that everyone loves to praise, let's hop into the marketing side of things to help us understand which genre it is intended to be targeting towards. From the trailers to the advertisements, we can see a pattern that appears to be steering away from the classic horror trope and into a more of an action setting, which makes sense seeming as the first game took place a week into an outbreak, and this has taken place within the first days of an outbreak. The original team behind Dead Space would eventually leave the project for other enterprises, perhaps not agreeing with the direction that the sequel was heading into. The studio would then shred its old persona of EA Redwood Studios and would become instead Visual Games, now with a new team to pick up where the old team had left off, creating a spin-off game in their absence, being called Dead Space Extraction. Starting with the ground up, the team felt that building the world and the backstory would be a good idea, with an animated movie titled Dead Space Aftermath, telling the story of Strauss and how he would come to be in the company of Isaac Clarke. The marketing of the first game focused on showing off horror with the use of a nursery rhyme, twisting it into a new and terrifying concept that had fit into the game's overall theme, which is what the second would do at first, with Ring Around the Rosie, which had started making it look promising until the next line of teasers was to come out, focusing on the message, "Your mom hates Dead Space 2, and that's why you're gonna love it."
I think it'll make a person become insane.
This game is an atrocity.
It's revolting. It's violent. It's everything you love in a game. And your mom's gonna hate it.
Why would they even make something like this?
Dead Space 2, rated M for mature.
Which, I don't know about you, but that seems like they were marketing this towards kids or edgy teens. Which, given the first was an 18 rated game, seems a bit off for a sequel. The adverts would show the unsuspecting mothers to the grim, bloody and disturbing world of Dead Space, capturing their overall reactions, with some being disturbed and downright terrified of the footage being presented to them. Except for one. I don't know about you, but this mother, she seems to be packing balls of steel compared to the rest. The launch trailer would give off a similar theme. Instead of focusing on showing the horror side of things, they marketed the game as an action thriller instead of sci-fi horror, which, given what it has Isaac do in the game, does not surprise me. Maybe the dev team was exposed to the effects of the marker, as when they say they made a horror game, it comes across as a bit delusional in my opinion, as I don't think of Dead Space 2 as a standard horror, especially in the twisted existence of Dead Space. The game would be backed up by a short puzzle game titled Dead Space Ignition, and another game that surprisingly acts more in line with the original game than the sequel does, being titled Dead Space but only available on iPhones, not Androids, in the Google Play Store. Getting past the setup for the release, we come to the launch of the game, with the opening sequence being one of installing the creepy factor right off the bat, which is great. But instead of easing the player into it, like the previous installment did, with easing the player into that sense of mystery that horror titles lean heavily upon. However, the opening sequence serves to be more of a recap of the previous game in a brief 3 minutes, when the original had an opening sequence of nearly 5 minutes, and it would take the player on average 10 minutes to soak up the ambience and the setting of the location before they had to run for their lives. The sequel wastes no time in throwing necromorphs straight at you, which would be okay if this game was to be intended as a action thriller, but instead people insist on it being a horror game, so I will criticize it as such. This would be like sitting down to watch a horror film without any suspense or tension, it just throws you straight into the action. The development team should have gone down the same route as the previous team if they were intending on improving the formula of the original horror. Instead, you basically do what you do in Dead Space, run for your life and get tackled into a quick time event, which funnily enough comes up more times than I can tell, and it isn't even necessary at half the times to give a quick time event. I mean, if you're being grabbed by an enemy, I can understand, and that's what the original dev team knew as well, but having them be present in nearly every engagement within a cutscene just makes it boring. It's like telling a joke. I could tell you a great, outstanding joke that would make you laugh, but if I replayed the joke over and over again, it starts to become less funny. That's why comedians refrain from telling the same story over and over again, because it isn't funny after you tell it again and again to the same audience. Are you starting to see where I'm going here? Anyway, back to the story. After leaving the psych ward, you are presented with a Kendra clone, Dana, who informs you that she wants to help Isaac and that he should trust her. But like many people, Isaac needs some convincing on that, which gives us the next plot point, that Isaac is developing a dementia case. And also, she is the only one that can cure him. At first he trusts her to a point, like many would, but after getting into an argument and a lockdown, he knows that he cannot navigate through the sprawl by himself, because they removed the fucking map, and decides to trust their uneasy alliance. The next 4 chapters has Isaac face the outbreak, seeing people be cut down and sometimes right in front of him, but mostly kept at a distance, which is odd. Surely the reason that you would have the setting being placed inside of an outbreak while it's happening within the first days would be to have the player be a part of the same experience as the the residents of the sprawl. Instead, what we are feeling is more of a gun-ho action with horror elements plastered in the background, in contrast of what the NPCs would be experiencing, that being a first-person psychological horror game. What mostly happens in the first act is seeing the outbreak from a distance while dealing with other necromorphs attacking you. Even when people are being attacked right in front of Isaac, he doesn't even try to help others, like the competition winner, trying to claw his way into the elevator only to be stabbed in the back by a slasher and dragged away, with Isaac only merely watching all of this unfold, which was a criticism of the previous game, that Isaac would witness something horrifying like someone's head explode, only for him to stand there like, neat, violence, when he should have had at least a reaction to it, not like it's just an average Monday. The dev team did put in reactions, but most of the voice lines and reactions sound as if they're coming from someone who just doesn't care. Isaac's sociopathic behavior could be seen to be a symptom from his torment and trauma, but it comes across as an inconvenience to Isaac instead. The main criticism of the first game was that the objectives were a bit repetitive. However, in this game, there really isn't any objectives, rather than get to this area. Good. Now run to this area. Great. Now run to this area. Which doesn't feel like you're doing anything that contributes to the situation. Rather, you are running to each area and the progression only exists for the outbreak and the environments you travel through. Instead, you have these mini games to complete that are in nearly every single chapter of the game that don't really contribute to Isaac's engineering skills. As when I think of engineers, the first thing that doesn't normally come to mind is hot wiring something like a car. At least in the original, I was collecting items, completing objectives, getting a sense of progression within the story, but in the sequel I only feel the progression for the outbreak and not the story itself. However, the story is very much centered around Isaac and his grief, which can be seen to be social commentary for mental health, which I think is a nice touch, but I just wish there was more to do in the story, like maybe in the early chapters something goes wrong and oxygen begins decreasing in the area. Isaac, seeing how this was going to be a problem for him, not just for him though, but also for others, would investigate, while having Dana tell him to leave it would show Isaac's moral compass along with his empathy towards the civilians. But no, objectives are bad, destinations are better, right? After meeting Dana, Isaac would remark that she is a unitologist and asks her why he trusted her in the first place. I mean, I understand Isaac does not like unitology at all because of his mother's betrayal, but come on. Isaac has met at least one unitologist that actually tried to do the right thing, so why does he immediately not trust her because he finds out about her beliefs? Although in hindsight, perhaps Isaac is an excellent judge of character, as like Kendra, Dana betrays Isaac, but here it's like he was complimenting to himself in the elevator. But she's gonna betray me, she's gonna do it, she's gonna do it! So my question is, why even bother meeting her if you had that suspicion already? Surprise, surprise though, the EarthGov soldiers, or should I say stormtroopers, that are piloting a ship find Isaac just before he gets put into stasis and imprisoned by the unitologists, and begins to blast the platform with a hail of bullets coming from a Gatling cannon. Oh, and another quick-time event later, Isaac escapes through some sort of miracle with not even a scratch on him, even though there were bullets hailing all around him, which I find is just bullshit. This shouldn't be called Dead Space, it should be called Scarlet Space, as this man in cutscenes is invincible to all damage. No joke, he literally becomes invincible. He cannot die in cutscenes. The dev team actually made that a thing, but in regards to the story, I feel like the amount of luck Isaac bestows, he should be called the Master Clerk. After this, your main objective is to find Stross, so he can help you destroy the marker, which leads you to another survivor, Ellie, who is just all talk at this point, stating when she finds Stross that if he does anything stupid, she will shoot him. But I guess screwdriver in the eye isn't anything stupid, right? After meeting Strauss and Ellie and having a confrontation with Tideman, who shuts down the power to the transport hub, which in turn stops Isaac from progressing to the government sector where the marker is being held, the three would be forced to work together to fix the solar array to provide the Sprawl with backup energy to power the transport hub. But just as Isaac soars through the space at what seems like 100 miles per hour and comes straight to a halt as he crashes through a ceiling vent. Yeah, right, Isaac totally did not take any damage, right? Seriously, he should be Crimson Jam by now. But now, because he is the main character, he survives while everyone else didn't invest in that plot armor. Pretty lucky Isaac stocked up on that just before the outbreak. The transport hub would soon explode to everyone's surprise, and they are forced into a difficult decision to run to the lesser of two evils, the CEC facility, that had been overrun at the start of the outbreak within the public sector, which actually starts to feel more like classic Dead Space, with tension and suspense taking the forefront rather than the action gun hoeing your way to Ellie. Isaac would eventually complete what seems like the second objective that doesn't just involve running to a specific destination, which is a short puzzle which is easy to follow. Isaac would then take the transport down to Ellie and Strauss, who then start talking about the Ishimura, which is very interesting. Seeming as Isaac recognizes that he cannot remember the last 3 years, but only now remembers everything. But then another problem occurs, prompting him to take a look and burn the corrupted growth away by exploding the tripod nest, which allows them to escape. However, Tideman returns this time to cut the track in half, stopping their progress once again, with Ellie stating that they cannot get across, there are no tracks. This is where I started thinking, are we not in space? Why can we not just use the momentum from the speed that we would be traveling at to crash into the government sector? But I guess any reason to revisit the Ishimura again, right? Which I believe is a missed opportunity in my opinion, as it could have been Nicole messing with Isaac, tugging on his memories of the characters in the previous game because apparently he remembers all of it now, asking him things about Hammond and Kendra, how he must have felt about them and their deaths. Instead, the tension and suspense and eeriness is broken by a brute jump scaring the player, and other necromorphs appearing, with some appearing out of thin air like the instant transmission, which just breaks the immersion for me. The chapter does bring in some actual objectives to complete, which does make it feel like you are preparing the ship for something to happen, rather than running to the bridge straight away and a cutscene does everything for you. Isaac would then run through the other decks and get to the captain's nest after facing off against countless necromorph hordes to use the gravity tethers to pull the government sector back into position, allowing Ellie and Strauss to make it across as Isaac gets into an escape pod but then blacks out as he crashes it into the mines. In the mines, Strauss attacks and stabs Ellie in the eye, which creates the old Neversoft logo. Since we meet Strauss with the eyeball still on the screwdriver, Ellie would then lose her cutter and have a brawl with Strauss. Instead, when I feel it robs her of that getting revenge on him. Instead, Isaac kills him, even though he apparently needs him to lead Isaac to the marker, but then blames his actions on the marker even though he did it himself without any hallucinations or aid from the marker influence being present, which just looks to be him coping. However, Nicole would appear again, but this time acting more aggressive, grabbing Isaac and picking him up, slamming him against the wall as she chokes him, and asks again who she is to him, which is a great moment in the story, but is overshadowed by, this is kind of immersion breaking for me, as all I'm thinking of is the cutscene from chapter 4 when Isaac realizes that Nicole was not attacking him, but instead he was attacking himself. So my question is, how is Isaac being held in the air while choked by Nicole? Is he supposedly doing this to himself within the hallucination? However, as soon as she releases him from her grasp, Isaac suddenly trusts Nicole again for some unknown reason. Isaac would meet with Ellie again, take a drill to the government sector, crashing through with Isaac on top of it, which Isaac remarks to be unhurt, which is surprising to me, seeming as he has walked off worse without any complaints. Seriously, how was crashing into a building at 100 miles per hour worse than this, Isaac? Please explain that one to me. He would eventually lock Ellie in a gunship and continues with his mission as she floats away into the dark void of space, with Nicole asking him to make her whole, which doesn't really make much sense, as the reason for the make her whole thing in Dead Space 1 was to place the marker on the pedestal, but now has been rewritten to be this new cryptic message to whatever end that Visual had deemed necessary back then, and they would put this in nearly every single piece of media that they could get their hands on. Isaac would then traverse through the government sector, unleashing the Horde upon Tiedemann and his men, allowing him access to the marker. And after poking himself in the eye and traveling to the marker, Nicole asks Isaac to meet her at the marker, with him complaining that he will never see her again, when throughout the entire game he has been very resentful of her presence, only for him to do a 180 with her now, which feels very rushed and unearned. Isaac would soon make it to her and kill Tiedemann, but as it seemed like the ending was near, surprise, surprise, Nicole betrays Isaac, leading into a battle within his own mind. Yep, that's correct. In one of the most annoying boss fights of the decade. Come on, seriously, they could have done something a little bit more interesting with this fight. Instead, defeat the apparition, then attack the heart, rinse, repeat, done. Oh, and you have to fight the Shadow Pack necromorphs too, that have the ability to grab you, which will result in an instant game over, with Isaac shooting himself with the javelin gun that Tiedemann just has laying around for emergencies. And as the station is charging up for the core to explode, Ellie crashes through the station ceiling to rescue Isaac with another quick time event. And that's the story in a nutshell, so let's get over to the audio side of things, shall we? There isn't much to talk about here, but the audio utilizes the same as the original except for one aspect, the removal of the paced musical themes, which is fair I guess because this is not actually a horror game but an action game in disguise, as I did not hear any of the changes to the overall themes of the music while comparing the different travelling methods, those being idle, walking and running. The ambience matches the original take to a T, with hearing objects rattling around in the distance to people panicking, with others shouting through their apartment doors while hearing distant roars from necromorphs. The music for the most part is great, like the opening being a reprise to Welcome to the USG Ishimura, keeping in tune with that. However, that sense of overall panic with the music is pretty much gone, with an action-orientated theme playing instead. The sequel brings about a new type of innovation, that being the zero-G areas, as another criticism of the original was that the jumping around from spot to spot was very disorientating and made people feel sick, so Visual decided on building upon that, so that players can now fly freely through these areas, moving with the aid of Buster Boots like another character. Now, with this improvement, however, it can be seen to be a step in the right direction, and adding these type of changes helps to make it better than what came before. The cutscenes are completely different to the original concept. In the first game, cutscenes would play, but would not take the control of the character away from you, allowing you to have a bit more of an immersive playthrough, allowing you to move around and loot the area if needs be. However, now you are forced to watch these cutscenes without even being able to do much of anything other than gain a new sense of security that the game never capitalizes off of, that the original did. Since nothing can kill Isaac outside of a QuickTime event in a cutscene, with Dead Space there has always been a sense of safety within these cutscenes, but the necromorphs could always come in, either interrupting the dialogue or straight after. The reason for the change is because without the use of loading screens to cut the chapters up, areas would not load in correctly, sending players to their doom within the bottomless void of space. Cutscenes in this and in Dead Space 3 act now as loading screens, hence why you cannot skip them. However, I would rather a quick loading screen rather than cutscenes that cannot be skipped on every single playthrough, which people did complain about for the first game. The necromorphs were also another change that did not require a redesign, but maybe just a quick polish. As in Dead Space, they made the necromorphs appear human, making them more relatable to the player, even with the enhanced versions, giving them an echo of what they once were. However, the enhanced slashes look cartoony and not overall relatable, which the original was, which looks to be a parody of the original design for the sequel. The rest of the necromorphs look pretty good, it's just the enhanced slashes that just make me want to laugh at most points. However, again, the sequel does do something right with Dead Space 2. The kinesis and stasis within the previous game were buggy to the point of it being a coin flip whether the mechanics work in your favor. In Dead Space 2, the stasis lands where you are aiming at every time, rather than the coin flip, which is very satisfying. However, they have also halved the amount of times you can use the stasis before it becomes depleted and merely slows the target down by 2 to 3 seconds, which seems about the same amount of time necromorphs take to recover from a knockback effect. So what is the point now, along with the stasis doesn't work in the same way as it did before? Before, using the stasis on a necromorph slowed it right down. In Dead Space 2, however, it slows it slightly until you upgrade it. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's pretty much up to you. But for me, it's kind of an annoying concept. But the stasis module can now actively recharge, making the resource management of collecting stasis packs kind of pointless or obsolete when it becomes fully upgraded. The kinesis also got an upgrade in the sequel with the ability to rip the limbs off of the deceased necromorphs that can be fired at the active necromorphs, if that's what you are supposed to call them, to impale them. So what's the point of a gun that does the exact same thing, other than using the alt fire electrical charge? However, that isn't my only thoughts. I like this because it does show Isaac's creativity when under a great deal of stress, but it's not a skill that he learns from a certain area, even though there is an area that does tell you that you can do this, but you can easily find this out for yourself at the start of the game. However, one thing that does make me wonder is how they would explain why can you rip off the blades off of dead slashes but not the ones that are alive? I understand that would be overpowering, but it does make you wonder. I think the new tools and weapons of Dead Space really is the separator from the setting of the two games. Since this is a space station, there would be more military choices of weaponry to choose from, like the detonator, which arguably does have the most boring alt fire possible, deactivating the mines you set up. Useful, yes, only when you want to conserve ammo, but it could have been better if the team had been a bit more creative with their choices. The Seeker rifle is also a nice weapon, acting as a futuristic sniper rifle with a zoom alt mechanic. I used this weapon when defeating the Stalkers at first, which brings us to our next point. The Stalker areas are a great way to keep the pace in the game by slowing the player down, by turning the action-orientated game turn into a cat and mouse game, with the Stalker almost hunting you like a pack of wolves, carefully planning their next move, poking their heads out from the corners to see you before charging, giving the necromorphs the illusion that they have more intelligence rather than just being mindless monsters. One thing I did like with the back and forth with Tideman though was that it was like a chess game. As Isaac would overcome certain challenges moving his pieces into place, Tideman would counteract with his own moves, but eventually Isaac claims checkmate by rushing the base with his smoking gun, the necromorphs. Another change was the removal of the map, as in the first game they give you a 3D map which allowed you another way of finding your objectives and getting around the ship. and seeing the deck in full. However, perhaps the development team saw this as obsolete with the locator and did not feel the need to implement a map into the game, but I feel it was kind of a missed opportunity and it would have been nice to see one being used within the game. The last thing for this part I wish to talk about within the gameplay side of things is the new suits and the retractable helmets, which was kind of an unnecessary change but still looks cool, and it's not hard to see where they got their inspiration from. Seriously, in Dead Space 4 we might actually see nanotech technology for the suits. Wouldn't that be fucking interesting? Instead of the fucking retractable helmets, mate, we'd have the retractable suits. If anyone didn't guess what I was talking about, their main inspiration was Iron Man. Regardless of how you feel about them, the suits in the last entry gave us more of a grounded feel to the setting and location. However, now it just looks to be more of, let's make the suits look cooler, because why not? Dead Space 2 being an action game, let's just face it, it is an action game, guys. Bringing in something that the previous entry did not do due to its setting of mainly being a horror game with the intention of trying to scare people rather than thrill them, Dead Space 2 brings in a new game mode, the multiplayer, where players can either play as a recombinated scourge festering within the sprawl itself, or the Titan security forces charged with defeating the new threat. The multiplayer back in its prime was fun, however it too did have its faults with the progression system. See, the multiplayer consisted of a rather primitive system, that being the more levels you go up, the more upgrades that are unlocked and set in motion for your necromorph class, and for the humans you gain cosmetics and weapons to be used within the game. The amount of damage players would sustain in a match revolved around their rank at the time, so it wasn't really much of a question of skill, but rather a question of rank. As the higher the rank, the more difficult the opponent will be, giving the multiplayer a rather unbalanced system that was not new player friendly. With most multiplayers from that time, like Call of Duty, you are able to unlock new weapons, perks, and other things to customize your class to your liking. However, these things would either be balanced or revised, and balanced later. With Visceral Games, they decided to solely develop the DLC and completely forgot about the multiplayer except for adding in new maps, let's not forget about that, as further DLC. But back in the launch of the game, the multiplayer was challenging but fun. However, now no one even plays the multiplayer due to the fact that it is not new player friendly, as a spitter can just 2-hit kill you if they are fully upgraded, which unlike other games, as soon as you unlock these aspects, they are with you whether you like it or not. However, if we go into the human side of things, the only thing I would say that is overpowered for them is the stasis, since the lurkers and pack aren't exactly worth playing as because they are weak. And when stasis, it isn't a matter of if you will die, it is a matter of when you will die. The necromorph selection screen is also a poor one, giving you the option to play as one of the 4 necromorphs, each with their own waiting time before you can spawn in as them, and the only way to spawn in is from vents, making it kind of predictable where players would spawn in from in certain areas of the map. The gameplay would consist of humans needing to complete objectives within a time limit, and the necromorphs must delay them until the time runs out, which means in a nutshell, camp in the blind spots and abuse the spitter again and again, given that they are the most durable in the game and they deal the most damage. I feel like adding in more of a selection of necromorphs would have kept this mode alive for longer, maybe letting players play as classic necromorphs such as the Leapers, Dividers, and Pregnants would have helped to spice things up, or even given players the entire roster with a points system in place, meaning the more points you gather through defending objectives or killing players would allow you to unlock bigger and badder necromorphs, which would have made it more fun in other game modes as well, and would not have only led to 2 types of necromorphs being the most used. However, Visceral decided on letting you play as a pack member, a lurker, a puker, or a spitter, which is a mediocre selection in my opinion. Can you guess which 2 were the most abused necromorphs to play as here? It actually surprised me that they went for the objective game modes, as judging from the story I thought objectives were indeed a thing of the past. But I think more game modes would have helped in creating more of a memorable experience, not just objective based modes, as you could have had similar to Dead by Daylight, but with the use of the necromorphs being the killer, as you players are humans who have to utilize their wits and tricks to survive rather than gun-hoing everywhere. Also, a horde mode would not have hurt at all. This game wasn't, in my opinion, as impactful as the first if looking at the horror elements in the game. It was more orientated to action rather than disturbing the player and making them feel on edge. However, there was some elements like, say, for instance, an audio log in chapter 6 that actually made me feel like, holy shit. However, criticism again brought about change that set the game's direction towards more action rather than dread and horror. The game isn't a horror game in my opinion, but rather a sci-fi action thriller game, as the pace of the story and the lack of objectives makes it feel like you are there to be an action hero blasting through the hordes, rather than someone fighting to survive this nightmare. Which isn't a bad thing, it's still a fun game. However, even though it isn't what I consider it to be a Dead Space game, it is still, as I just said, an enjoyable experience to be had for long-time fans, and including myself, which is why most see it as the best in the series. However, we'll have to wait and see what my ranking is, but for now I will give this game an 8 out of 10, mainly because having horror be played in the background rather than in the forefront isn't exactly what I look for when playing a survival horror game, which is what this is categorized as when I see it as a survival action game. If Dead Space is a classic horror experience, then Dead Space 2 is a classic blockbuster experience, which is perfectly fine in itself. In the beginning of the marketing for Dead Space 3, a comic would be released, being the only form of a backstory for the game, and the characters and lore it would be introducing into the story being titled Dead Space Liberation. It tells the story of John Carver and how he came to be in the partnership with Ellie and Norton. The comic does appear to stick to what the franchise is known for, which is a horror side to things, within the visual aspect, but does not cling to overall horror, much like seen in Dead Space 2. The marketing for the trailers has a mix of horror and action, with them giving off a feeling of dread in each of them. However, others give off more of a chilled approach, with how the footage has been edited to fit in line with the song chosen. So it would seem that the game was to be confused at what it wanted to be from the ground up, with the story being fitted with two very different plots, with the plot of the machine on Tal Volantis, and the plot of Isaac's relationship with former lover Ellie and Norton, who we are forced to dislike because he is a jerk. The game actually possesses a prologue instead of doing what the first game did. However, the story can be seen to be a healthy mix between the two in some aspects. However, in others, it would bring up the criticisms again. The game starts off with you playing as a soldier, or soldiers depending on if you are playing co-op, which only slightly changes the story with different dialogue in areas where there wouldn't be any dialogue, or dialogue that feels forced to relay information to the player. You are tasked with finding a device in the wilderness called a codex that would be used to save everything, as Dr. Serrano puts it, giving us the concept for an interesting story. However, thanks to the trailers, we know this not to be the case, as we know that something is going to hinder their progress, and that something is General Mahad, who shoots Tim, deletes the information stored on the device in an effort to stop whatever the Doctor has in mind to ensure the survival of humanity, who then commits suicide, and the game cuts back to the present day with Isaac mourning the death of his relationship with Ellie that happened off screen. Norton and Carver would eventually find him and recruit Isaac to save Ellie, and would have to face a new enemy, which is the main criticism for the game: human enemies, with the addition to the fanatical faction known as the Unitologists. Isaac would overcome the challenges and would escape an outbreak thanks to the leader of the Circle, Danik, who releases the marker, unleashing a tidal wave of hell upon the citizens of the lunar colony. On board the Eudora, Isaac and the team would soon come across Tau Volantis, seeing the wreckage of the Sovereign Colony warships floating in space, which is a nice touch as it brings us back to what we have seen in the original, without it feeling like a cheap copy and paste. However, in their sightseeing, they become swarmed by space mines that proceeds to destroy the ship, prompting all to abandon the ship, leading into another sequence brought about in the second game, where Isaac travels at what looks to be 100 miles per hour until reaching the Roanoke. No, not that Roanoke, this Roanoke. Okay, we're not doing that. Which the game does exceptionally well compared to the predecessor. Upon entering the station that allows you to open the door and vent air into the station even though there is no power running in the station itself, which is an odd choice, but I guess we aren't meant to ask these questions. However, it is odd that a station that has been left to rot without maintenance for the last 200 years operates like it is in perfect order, despite some of the creaks from the huge bulkhead doors. It seems that all the smaller doors needed was some elbow grease from the Kinesis module to get it working again. Eventually, Isaac meets the slasher forms that appear to be hibernating, which again is an odd choice that they would do this, especially when clinging to the ceiling like a bat. Wouldn't it have made more sense to have them lurking within the vents with ambient noises every now and again, giving that feeling of the station being haunted, seeming as the setting does indicate that this is a tomb with caskets and the creaks you hear every now and again, giving the horror aspect more reinforcement. But nope, instead the necromorphs just wake up and start attacking you once more. After dealing with the old enemies, Isaac would restore power and meet up with the team, finding Ellie, which brings us to the moment that makes me think, why are we bringing in a love triangle? Especially weird, seeming as Isaac remarks that Ellie moved on fast. Instead of hating Norton, which is a theme that gets shoved into our faces throughout the game, I started to dislike Ellie from this revelation of her character, being rather impulsive and not taking Isaac's feelings and what he meant to her into consideration. Much like the dialogue between Isaac and Carver, but at least Carver has a reason as to why he acts blunt and cold towards others. Like Ellie just sat there and said to Isaac, "No matter, I can always find another to give me what I need." However, this isn't the only time that she does this. Eventually they address the elephant in the room, which is escaping, but Ellie and Norton start to argue about going down to the planet, after Isaac starts to go into a chant stating to turn it off, giving them the instructions to turn off a device found down into the planet. They eventually find a shuttle that was to be scrapped, but after finding and tinkering with it a little bit, they are then able to take it down to the planet, which is what they do, which is arguably the best part of the game, with the music and the gameplay along with the sound effects making it an epic moment within the story when you break through the atmosphere. The game does this very well, making the moment feel grounded and real, especially when all hell seems to break loose in this rickety ship and Isaac has to fix the engine tanks. Eventually the shuttle becomes so unstable that it breaks into two pieces, separating the team from Isaac, or Isaac and Carver if played in co-op. It is from here Isaac must battle the cold using fires and keeping his core temperature up throughout his travels, which would have been a nice dynamic to the gameplay if the temperature meter would decline faster. But you can safely make it to the area you need to be without much hassle. However, this is where things with enemies start to fall apart, as when you were inside of ships or stations in the franchise, enemies would spawn out of vents, which would be natural, but here they sprout straight from the ground, which to me is a little bit weird, but maybe that's just me. The blizzard, on the other hand, made me enjoy one sighting when a necromorph came charging out of the thick fog, with the sound being heard before the sighting, which is a nice touch. I only wish they did this with the blizzard more often. Once you make it to the bunker, you will see Buckle die of hypothermia, accompanied by a softer, sad theme, which again is a nice touch. However, progressing into the bunker presents us with the most annoying enemy type in the game. The feeders, which is what happens when you eat necromorphs, leaning into the contagion lore presented from Dead Space, which was later retconned in Dead Space 2, to make it that the marker twists dead bodies to its will, not a recombinated lifeform. It would seem Visceral bends the lore to their will, much like the marker, when it is convenient for them, but would still give us lore to suggest that the marker creates the necromorphs. The feeders cannot be killed by simple dismemberments, something that the franchise is known for, and instead are killed by a headshot, which is nice to switch things up, but given the main theme of combat is to dismember, I think this was an unnecessary change, to say the least. The feeders are basically adult pack necromorphs, except they are a lot more durable when going for body shots. Isaac would soon get another suit that enables him to travel through the blizzard unharmed by the temperature, and after a QuickTime event, which this game does love to use, seems like Visual gets a hard-on for these, as they use them quite a bit in Dead Space 2, and arguably they use them more in Dead Space 3, which can be seen to slow the progression of the game, but it's just boring in my opinion. After this event, the blizzard disappears, allowing Isaac to find the facility, where he battles a boss known as the Snow Beast, which is, again, arguably the most buggiest boss in the entire franchise. But more on that later. As Isaac meets up with Ellie, Norton starts to feel left out and starts arguing with Ellie, which nearly causes a fight between him and Isaac. Now, I don't know about you, but for me this love triangle should not be here, as it is just unnecessary drama put there to make the player hate Norton, when all it shows is how Ellie is unable to see how her impulsive behavior makes others feel. I mean, how would you feel if your partner was acting super friendly with their ex? I think you would be kind of annoyed as well, wouldn't you? Especially when they give their ex more attention than they give to you, their current partner. It does seem that Visual is as delusional as this love triangle arc. With this part over, we get into the return of the unitologists, as they once again get in between Isaac and the team, separating them, which isn't at all surprising at this point. All Visual seem to do is separate the main character or characters from the NPCs. After dealing with the necromorphs and the unitologists, Isaac would come to the Nexus, a huge necromorph form that is dormant for unknown reasons, that doesn't get explained for, again, reasons. Isaac would reactivate the furnaces, but the kicker for this part is this line coming from Santos. "Come up to the observation booth, I'll explain it on the way." On the way. Very funny visual, seeming as the elevator is locked, so instead of explaining it on the way, she explains it, then you take the elevator up to the observation booth. It is a small detail, but it does frustrate me all the same. After finding the parts, Isaac would travel into the belly of the beast, shooting the nerve clusters, which begs the question, if markers control the necromorphs, why would they need nerves? Especially as they don't even respond to pain at all, at least like any other creature does. Shooting these will reveal the enhanced feeders to you, and oh man, these monsters mean business, as they can spawn from almost anywhere inside the fleshy tunnels, behind the cage, everywhere, which doesn't give you room to breathe, especially if you choose the cage to be where you camp, as these guys, if they get into the cage with you, then yeah, you are indeedly going to have quite a fun time dealing with them. Eventually, after the second wave, Norton pulls you out of the belly and proceeds to tell Ellie that he loves her for Ellie to just say, Oh yeah, of course. Which is just cold and does not make her likable in my opinion. It's almost like this isn't even a drama, it's rather just a comedy, because with lines like those, the game becomes laughable, especially when she just glazes over this moment to inform Isaac what to do next, ignoring her current boyfriend. Notice how I say current. It's almost like Ellie is the human marker. Norton would, surprise surprise, betray Isaac, cause if Visual knows how to do anything, it would be betraying people. It seems to be a current theme throughout the games. However, Isaac escapes the cage and makes it outside, where he would be ambushed by the unitologists, who then explain of how they found the planet. Guess who? Norton. Ta-da! I have to hand it to Norton. No one else has managed to betray Isaac twice in a row. However, like many delusional antagonists, Danik tries to kill Norton for doing all of this, for Isaac just to save Norton before getting into a firefight that ends when you cross a certain threshold, getting you into a boss fight that resembles attacks from the Hive Mind from Dead Space 1 that was criticized for being too easy and more bombastic in its appearance. However, despite doing what you normally would in this scenario, Isaac still ends up being swallowed whole by this creature. However, after becoming too hot to handle within the stomach, the giant beast regurgitates him out, attempting to kill him, but instead it attacks itself like brushing off a fly from your arm. And instead, Isaac falls to the ground and the monster just disappears. Honestly, I don't really know what to make of this battle, but let's just say that the game rewards our heroism for saving Norton by giving us the opportunity to kill Norton ourselves in self-defense. This event was probably for the best because Norton was about as useful as Visual seems to be in creating a story. Relaying the news to Ellie gives us a rather shocked Ellie, which is hilarious in itself, as she didn't seem to care that he was there or not, or even existed previously. And for an entire chapter, we have her blaming us, saying that we sabotaged the mission, when in reality she never gave a damn until he was dead. It seems like as soon as they got to the planet, Ellie was on Isaac's side, because he agreed with her, and that's the only reason. Her reaction feels very much unearned, and does not relate to how she has treated Norton throughout the entire game. Eventually, after some tedious climbing sections, Santos falls down to the ground below, killing her after Carver cuts the cable to the cage because of the snow beast clinging to the platform. This throws Isaac into a bit of a frenzy as he was trying to save her, showing us a new side to Isaac, which should have really been something that Isaac should have shown in Dead Space 2, but regardless, he now possesses empathy towards others, which leads into the third time we face the snow beast, which thankfully there are some harpoons here ready to skewer something. How convenient. However, I'm not about to question that blessing in disguise, as this snow beast was really annoying, not because of the overall steps required to defeat it, but it was just really repetitive because of how buggy it was to deal with. After ripping the beast in half and climbing up a short cliff face, we get another unearned cutscene of Ellie telling Isaac of how good of a man he is, despite killing her partner in the last chapter. How convenient that all of his so-called wrongdoings to her and Norton of his sabotage was suddenly forgiven. After this, they make their way to the tram, but oh no, Isaac is separated once again, which again is unnecessary. We could have just actually gone with them, but I guess we need to introduce the Twitchers to the game, which is just bullshit. Seeming as the unitologists use stasis grenades, not modules, and the sovereign colonies did not possess that technology 200 years ago. Stop asking those type of questions, right? The three eventually would meet up after another quick mini-game to find that what they need to do next is to find the slabs of Rosetta that are all over the facility, which would normally be disturbing that they would cut her into pieces. But with the drama with the love triangle and the action taking center stage over everything, first time playing this I wasn't actually disgusted by this revelation. More of, okay, when do I get to start killing things again? After collecting the pieces and placing them into the correct order, a cutscene will play that reveals probably one of the best plot twists in the franchise. That's what they thought was an original Planet 4 markers being made, with these aliens being the ones who created these accursed obelisks, to being revealed that the aliens were in fact in the same boat as them, and the moon is convergence, being the end goal for necromorphs to unite and become whole, as it always should have been. However, Isaac would soon activate the purge system to burn any and all organic life, but instead of shooting Isaac, Danik just runs away, which is again an odd choice. However, surprisingly, the A-team becomes Isaac and Carver, who just give chase to Danik after Ellie becomes trapped by the gas, which Isaac rightfully so breaks down, but not before Ellie delivers the punchline that she loves Isaac, when she just goes through partners like a woman goes through clothes, and does not feel earned at all. Like the game is saying all of these things for the sake of it, without any of the feeling behind it. Isaac would chase Danik into the city and would separate the codex from him. However, remember when I talked about kinesis and using it to pull enemy limbs off of the alive necromorphs? Well, with the special discs found on the floor, you can now do this with absolute no consequence to yourself, other than making you stagger like if you're on red health, which just makes them overpowered, as the discs are present in the key areas you need to complete objectives, allowing you to breeze on through without any cause for concerns, and the discs also enhance your stasis abilities too. However, the rest of the game is just configuring the machine and making your way to the top of the spire to finish the fight, but not this time, as Danik returns with a hostage, Ellie, who by some miracle survives the gases by climbing through the delivery tubes, which is just convenient that Danik's men would find Ellie and use her as a bargaining chip, as Carver does a 180 move and throws the codex to him, allowing Danik to turn off the machine, releasing the moon from its icy prison. Isaac would tell Ellie to run to a shuttle that is conveniently nearby, allowing her to escape while Isaac is left to defeat the moon, but not before Ellie gives him the last kiss for good luck, and Isaac gives this quote, "Don't come back for me. We both know that I'm not coming home." Isaac would traverse through a disintegrating world and would fight the moon using the markers that just so happened to be floating nearby to hurt the massive creature. However, in the dumbest move any boss could do, it tries to swallow the machine, which ends up shredding its insides when Isaac uses his powered up kinesis and then goes to the machine, destroys the moon and Isaac and Carver all fall together to what seems like their impending deaths, before hearing at the end of the game Isaac calling out to Ellie, which would turn out to be true, that Isaac returns in the Awakening DLC that Visual could not resist in messing with the story any more than they already have. Could have left the story with a satisfying conclusion that they defeated the moon, which in turn stops the marker signal in its tracks, but nope, we need to keep making Dead Space games as it seems to be the only thing going for us at the time. So get ready for the return to the frozen tundra, which only serves to leave the series on a cliffhanger as Earth is ravaged by the once dormant moons. Despite the lackluster story, the music actually holds up pretty well, being, in my opinion, the best in the franchise. The sound effects are also pretty well done, along with the ambience. It certainly does give off more of an epic story feeling rather than sci-fi horror, though continuing the trend of changing the genre to suit new audiences, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but to call it horror just because of, oh, scary monsters and blood and gore doesn't mean it's necessarily a horror game. It's like saying Diablo 2's a horror game. The most notable change is the new resource system that was made to show off Isaac's capabilities as an engineer, not just in the maintenance benches but for the suit stations as well, allowing you to customize your weapons to your own preferences, which is very well done. Want a flamethrower machine gun? Go for it. Maybe a javelin gun that's semi-automatic? Basically, if you have the components, you can make hundreds of different combinations to give you the weapon you've always wanted. However, this did come with some major criticisms that everyone loves to talk about, and that is the resource gathering bot that gathers resources and returns to the bench, giving you a slight income of resources for you to manage. However, there is also an option to pay for extra resources if you wish not to grind for the parts or resources. You can instead pay for them. Other YouTubers will have you believe that the resources are scarce in the game because EA uses this as a tactic to get you to spend more money, which is far from the truth, as yes, the resources may be scarce. But really, that is the main point for Dead Space 3, that the planet and remaining ships have been left out to rot for at least 2 centuries, along with the fact that the game is labeled as a survival horror game, even if the content held within acts more like a action survival game. So that would explain the lack of the resources. As in many titles that are based on survival games, there is a lack of resources. As if it just gave large amounts of resources to you straight up, there really would not be much of a progression through the game. You could easily just use the scavenger bot to scour through a few areas and then be fully upgraded by the end of the first act, allowing you to breeze through the rest of the game with no challenge in sight, which is what this game would be criticized for instead. The real reason that players will jump on the bandwagon to criticize EA for this is because it just gives them more opportunities to bash them, because EA is the common denominator of evil apparently. Like the argument that they had killed Visceral, which has aged very poorly. In reality, with whichever difficulty you are playing on or whichever game mode you choose, you can easily gather the resources required to build whatever you desire and upgrade what you want. The game even gives you the opportunity to redeem ration seals that can be found throughout the game in these parts boxes or from the scavenger bots. So if EA is to blame for this transgression, then you must also consider that they also give players the ability to dodge the paywall, instead of misleading the audience. And even if those arguments were true, it doesn't really matter, as the game is a single player or a cooperative experience rather than a competitive experience. If the game was a multiplayer experience, then yes, those arguments would have merit to them. The ration seals basically allow you to buy extra resources if you have the amount required for the pack. The only things that must be paid for are DLCs, such as new suits or the expansion Awakening. The game also possesses optional missions that you can access in solo and co-op. Completing these will give you access to a supply cache that will contain the part boxes as we have just talked about, but also the attachments or cores required to build new and interesting weapons, which you can also rip apart at the bench for extra resources. My only criticism about them is that when playing through them, it can seem that the game possesses infinite hordes of necromorphs, and the game will shove this in your face whenever it gets a chance. If we look at the lore for a planet of necromorphs, then yes, it would seem very likely to function like this, to overwhelm you. However, in a gameplay design, it becomes a little bit more tedious and exhausting to go through these areas, and most players I know just end up skipping these areas because it's just too tedious and exhausting, which will lead players to becoming bored rather than pulling the player in with other elements that the first 2 games did so well. In other areas of the game, I kept on thinking to myself, what the hell did I do to Visceral to deserve this? As it seems like the developers were punishing me for for some reason, as there are plenty of areas that become way too overwhelming later on in the game, like outside of the silo. As you walk out into this area, you'll be confronted with a group of cartoon-enhanced slashers. No big deal, they're pretty easy to deal with, but then a unitologist will spawn in on the icy ledge behind cover, along with more dropping in from above. Okay, well, it's pretty easy to deal with as well, but it's kind of annoying. But then, as you go to deal with the puzzle that is a locking mechanism for the door so you can progress, 2 unitologists will spawn in on top of the building you just came out of. But wait, they are using their own favorite weapon, the rocket launcher, and more unitologists will spawn in to swarm you as well. But if that wasn't bad enough, a large group of Twitchers will continuously keep spawning in from a few waves, regardless if you have fought off the current threat. Seriously, Visceral, it's like you wanted your studio to fade from existence because this is just unbalanced gameplay. What was it that Glenn used to say? Ah yes, it's like it's a joke. Play it on repeat constantly throughout the experience and it becomes less effective every time you hear it. It's the same for action, drama, horror, and video games. If you don't do anything to switch things up, then it will become boring and tedious to go through, like a chore. However, I feel like the entire game was designed solely for co-op, as these areas I just talked about feels like the gameplay was designed so that one character could fend off Team Rocket over there, and another could defend against the necromorphs, judging from the large amounts of enemies that become present in these areas. However, with gameplay looking to be designed for co-op, the cutscenes go in a completely different direction, with them solely being centered around Isaac, and Carver just gets thrown into the mix into certain situations in nearly every single cutscene, regardless if you are playing co-op or solo. I feel like they must have added these in the last few months of development, as regardless if you are playing by yourself or within co-op with a buddy, you are presented with the same cutscenes, not extra ones designed for that separate experience, making co-op nearly the same experience as solo. If it went for the co-op missions that do relate to some horror elements, and are by far the most possibly disturbing element in the entire game. The separation gameplay with the visuals and audios for both perspectives is my favorite innovation from this game. With Carver, you will see and hear hallucinations. For example, Carver will see giant toy soldiers, symbolizing his son, as a reference to the graphic novel or the comic Dead Space Liberation. With the audio side of things, Carver will start to hear messages from his wife playing. However, Isaac will not see the toy soldiers being present and will only hear garbled laughing along with other things of a disturbing nature coming from the deranged SCAF members, giving the two players different perspectives into what's happening within these scenarios. If only they just hadn't advertised this into the game's presentation, it could have been even a great twist within the game. I would have preferred these moments to stretch out over the course of the game. That would have gotten even more demonic and more terrifying as the game progressed. Kind of like our journey into the hell of Dead Space. However, I would have also liked these moments to stretch out throughout the entire game so that would act as some more reinforcement to Carver's progression for his character, so that the cutscene at the start of the alien city feels more heartfelt and earned. As in solo, Carver just stands there in the background while other characters are engaging with each other, not necessarily within a cutscene. With that being said, more dialogue and a few extra cutscenes were indeed added for co-op, but still struggles with the same weak progression of their relationship. The dev team also felt like giving Isaac's air counter a base upgrade was a genius idea. But I felt like, what's the point of upgrading the air if I already have a huge air timer? It seems like it would be a waste of resources and time. Due to the lack of interest of multiplayer in the last entry, the dev team also felt like multiplayer just did not interest players and was not giving players enough stimulation, when in reality it was because they made a poor system, they know they made a poor system, and they rejected the responsibility to update it to make the game more balanced. So this would be another reason to push for co-op in the sequel. The Snow Beast was in fact the most annoying boss in all of gaming history, and is still, to this day, on account that you have to chop off the 3 tentacles that sprout from its back like a lurker, and then destroy one of the sacs that comes from its mouth, which is a standard for bosses in most games. However, this one comes with some BS moments that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die, I swear to Christ. See, there can be times where the boss will in fact retract its tentacles, and say there's one left, yeah? As it does this to lunge at you, retracting the tentacles, but sometimes the tentacles will just regenerate as soon as it pops them back out, which only happens if it lashes at you with its tongue or you have destroyed one of the sacs resetting the stage, and other times it will push you into a corner with its attack and continue to ram into you until you eventually die or the game corrects the bug. It is safe to say that this game came out not just unfinished but underdeveloped as well, like as if a team just didn't really think about it before actually making it. Another criticism is the fact that you have human enemies in the game, when we have always seen humans pose threats towards us, whether that be Dr. Mercer by creating the Hunter to fight you, or Dana tricking you, or Tideman sabotaging your attempts to get to the marker, along with the many humans blocking your path. But instead of doing what this game does, you let the Necromorphs deal with them by simply pulling out a switch. Yeah, it's so fun just watching the Necromorphs just run down a hole. It really shouldn't have mattered if we were battling against humans or Necromorphs, as long as Necromorphs were a part of the mix. A few people do like to say that the combat is a rip from Gears of War, which is a poor argument to make nonetheless. Which I don't know about you, but crouch running is not a thing in this game, chainsaws are not a thing in this game. Seriously, where's the resemblance of Gears of War? But I guess the only thing that resembles Gears of War gameplay is the crouching behind cover and maybe the rolling, but it has been years since I've played a Gears of War game, so don't quote me on that. The only bad thing about the Unitologists is the fact that they aren't very good as soldiers, but I think that's overall the point. There's Unitologists aren't really trained as Marines or Commandos, so they wouldn't be menacing on the battlefield. However, the AI will at times just stand there and spray bullets at you out in the open, which is strange for me, but I did find it very entertaining just sitting back, relaxing with a smoke, and just letting the Necromorphs have their merry little way with them. At times it was fun to watch the soul beings they wish to become tear the believers down without a second thought, while having them scream, "What the hell is that?" Yeah, like you don't know. Like the first game, this game has a hidden message with the first letter of each chapter. Taking each letter and spelling them out creates "The Brother Moons Are Awake," which is kind of smart and is a nice throwback, but it's kind of silly as well because it kind of just ruins that reveal in the DLC story. This game, like Dead Space 2, wasn't very scary. It was more heart-pumping action because of the overwhelming enemies on screen. The enemies for me were not exactly frightening, just slightly creepy, and I feel the same way about them as I do zombies. Not scary, but mostly I get the feeling of, let's go murder some Necromorphs with my new gun. If this was intended to be a horror game, then in solo they have failed miserably, succeeded slightly in the co-op missions due to the two separate perspectives. However, I think that calling this game a horror game is just an insult to other horror games out there. As yes, the game does support dark themes, but doesn't strictly make it a horror game. I give this game a 6 out of 10 for effort and creativity, but that is still being quite generous. So for the long-awaited ranking of the Dead Space games, I have actually decided to put the spin-off games into the ranking as well, as to entertain the idea. So here we go. At number 6 we have Dead Space 2. Now I know this is going to get a lot of you upset, but you are just going to have to accept the fact that it is the worst game of them all. The gameplay for what it is being very entertaining, but it is the story that ultimately lets it down. For number 5 we have, of course, Dead Space 3, as let's be fair, the action first and horror last attitude set in motion by the second game is probably the best direction for the series, and despite the poor job of the characters, it actually succeeds in creating a perfect simulation of the horror. For number 4, we have Dead Space Extraction. While being a on-the-rail shooter and having an amazing story, it does have the same problems as the cutscene loading screens in the later games, taking control away from the player. When we asked for a first-person Dead Space game, this isn't exactly what we were thinking, Visceral. Going into number 3, Dead Space Mobile does an amazing job at creating an atmosphere of dread, horror, and a story of a disturbing nature, something Dead Space 2 couldn't hope to emulate, and its gameplay is just one of the best in the series. However, the lack of lore makes it the number 3 spot. At number 2, we have Dead Space with its amazing story capturing that old school horror where the intention was to scare players and create that feeling of being disturbed, along with the lighting being the best in the series and the audio is just, wow. It kinda makes me speechless all the same. Now we come to number 1, being the best Dead Space game in the entire series, and I think we all know exactly what it is, so let's take it away. Dead Space Ignition, set just as the outbreak is starting, being a prologue to Dead Space 2. I feel that it perfectly captures the panic and the carnage this type of outbreak would have, and the plot twist just makes it the best in the series, as I never saw it coming. And there you have it. My ranking of all of the Dead Space games. Bet no one else will have a ranking quite like that. But if you have a better one, then please feel free to comment away. Okay, obviously that was a joke. I already said I wasn't going to add those games to my ranking, but I did want to put Dead Space 2 at the bottom to see how the veterans would react in the comment section. So let's talk about the real ranking of the 3. Guarantee I gave everyone a heart attack when I put a repetitive puzzle game at the number 1 spot. So for the ranking, I'm going to give you the truth to why these games should not be ranked or compared at all. This is due to each of the main games being their own separate thing. With Dead Space, it is a classic old school sci-fi horror story leaning towards franchises like Alien and standalones such as Event Horizon, along with The Thing to create something new and interesting. Dead Space 2 is an action blockbuster that puts horror in the background, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but calling a game a horror when all it does is provide some scares and gory scenes and expect it to work isn't, in my opinion, what a horror game should look like. It takes more than just a dark corridor with a few blinking lights to scare me, even if you put necromorphs in the mix. Still doesn't make it horror. Dead Space 3 takes action and the background horror to an open world setting in hopes of branching out to a broader audience, which ultimately creates a great parallel to the story of Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun. So the games are basically their own individual styles of Dead Space running into different categories, providing us with different takes, doing what Disney attempted to do with Star Wars, each team heading in a different direction. So I would say, want a fun horror experience? Then go play Dead Space 1. Need some action mixed in with that horror? Then please, go ahead and play Dead Space 2. Or perhaps you like to explore within an action setting and do not want to deal with the overall horror themes, while feeling like you're in an epic story. Well, Dead Space 3 has that for you too. Basically, Dead Space is a franchise that has a little bit of something for everyone, which I think is an interesting concept, especially when tying in all of the spin-off games, such as Extraction having that arcadey horror feeling like from House of the Dead, but in the Dead Space universe. or needing something horror related to play for short periods. With that being on the bus or waiting for a meeting, then Dead Space Mobile could be that for you. Or maybe you're into puzzle games but want a story-driven game as well, then Ignition has that for you. That seems to be the trend, but I just wish Visual Games or EA could have been a little bit more honest when labeling these games, or perhaps the industry just needs to add a few more variant genres to the list. However, for those who actually want to hear what I have to share, here is my official ranking of the Dead Space main games, which is, of course, my opinion, and my opinion alone will differ from yours. So at number 3 we have Dead Space 3 being the worst due to the terrible job that Visceral had put into the game while having more time than the original team did while making Dead Space. They still hadn't even come close. The cutscenes were messy, the balancing issues were a chore to deal with, especially in harder difficulties in game modes, along with the only reward for beating hardcore in one life was a filter which made hardly any difference other than having the pixels be noticeable. The characters' development looked as if the writers didn't seem to care about the engagements and their relations to each other and how that plays into the overall story. The audio and customization are the only saving graces, along with displaying the lighting that has been present throughout the series. The atmosphere feels as if overwhelming the player was the only way to make people feel scared, and I feel Visceral ran out of ideas, so they started trying to make the necromorphs act more like the Flood, you know, as in flooding the enemy through attrition. The story could have been saved if a little bit more care and attention to detail was applied, but Dead Space 3 was rightfully a step in the wrong direction and should have looked to improve the formula rather than completely forget about it, then halfway through development act like, oh crap, we forgot about the horror. So it comes across as a game that is having an identity crisis. On one hand, you feel like you are playing an epic action game. On the other hand, you have a game that is saying, I'm a horror game, when only a quarter of it even resembles a Dead Space game. The throwbacks to the original are great, and I have to praise the game for its willingness to change the norm in its pursuit to try something new. With my second in the ranking being Dead Space 2, as the action first horror later setting is present here. However, it did a lot more than the sequel does, with the combat being near the same as the original, with new weapons being available, all with their own unique abilities, with the bench getting a nice upgrade, allowing certain weapons to gain a special variant. For example, the secondary fire for the contact beam can be upgraded to stasis the area around Isaac, as well as knocking everything back. However, another interesting thing is the bonus suits, being the elite versions, and the DLC ones giving the player ample color variations to choose from, all with their own unique bonuses to suit their gameplay styles, no pun intended. However, I would have preferred a selection of different designs rather than color variations, which makes the action first, horror later setting become reinforced, especially with the color scheme being more colorful, with Dead Space 2 possessing more of a palette than the previous one did, with the first showing more gritty colors, showing more browns, oranges and greens rather than every color of the rainbow, as the concept of Dead Space was to make it look and feel grounded within the Dead Space universe, while Dead Space 2 feels less real, especially with some questionable actions like the Halo jump that Helios puts it so elegantly. That does look like Visceral were taking notes from the Halo series. I'm just surprised and thankful that Isaac did not find the Halo ring in the third entry. The story feels more empty than the first, with objectives being flung out into space and just having certain destinations be the only objective to pursue until you get to Chapter 7, which is halfway through the game, but there is only really one pit stop, which is defeating the AI system by completing a small puzzle and destroying some fuses. However, you only really feel like you are doing something to progress in a situation once you get to Chapter 10 by fixing the Ishimura once again, allowing Isaac to activate the gravity tethers, but the level was a missed opportunity. The multiplayer was not anything really to get excited for either, as the story isn't the only thing to have a progression system issue, as upgrades for the damage and durability for the necromorphs along with the humans was linked and forced into the leveling system, game, making a new player experience incredibly challenging, as the multiplayer also did not possess a skill-based matchmaking, making players' searching times easier but only to frustrate them while in the game, by going up against either low-ranked or higher-ranked opponents that would make the match unfair to either side. And finally, we come to the number 1 spot with Dead Space, the game that set the series in motion. The original motive for this game was to design and create an overall experience to scare whoever dared follow the blood trails through the Ishimura. The story can be hard to follow for some moments, as the game relies heavily upon exploration for your own investigation into how the ship came to be in this desolate space. The game overall can be quite fun, even when the bugs and glitches occur. The game feels exactly what I would expect from a game series that be in a horror setting, and that ever so familiar feeling of dread haunting you as you fight to survive. Because the objective was to create the scariest experience for that time, this game takes bits and pieces from other franchises and remolds them into a new and fun experience, much like how the Necromorphs do with Dead Flesh, reanimating them into new and terrifying concepts. The reason Dead Space is the best out of the main series is due to the right amount of time to set up the arrival of the Necromorphs. It's not too long to bore the player, but it's not too short as to rush into the action. It gives the player enough time to soak up the location and the overall theme for the game, so that you are more than prepared to run like hell into that dark abyss within the Planet Cracker. From what it does best, it also does have some flaws within the story, with players suspecting something was off with Nicole from the start, as to why she would appear in screens or audio transmissions. Perhaps if they had her appear only slightly, like turning the corner to see Nicole walking towards an objective, with your view being obscured, or Nicole's back only being seen as she gets pulled out of view, would make the player more confused and creeped out at her sightings. But maybe we will see these things be implemented into the remake. From what the team were able to create in the span of 14 months, it's really impressive that they were able to create such an immersive and horrifying experience in such a short time, along with creating other pieces of media to build the world before the game even came out, setting the stage for the outbreak. However, this video was just my criticisms and opinions, but I think we all know what the hardcore veterans will say after watching this video. We can only imagine. It was only one video.
One. Are you sure?
Yes. It was to show my viewpoints of the franchise.
Why did you not review the script?
I did, but I saw it to be a just opinion.
When you first played Dead Space 2, were you blinded by its majesty?
Blinded?
Paralyzed? Dumbstruck?
No.
Yet you allowed your disdain of the action gameplay to cloud your judgment and desecrate it with your filthy thoughts.
Noble hierarchs, surely you understand that Dead Space 2 has its flaws.
There will be order in this fandom.
You were right on focusing on bringing us an unbiased review, but this retrospective, this ranking, by the time I saw the damage being done, there was nothing I could do.
Noble prophet of the marker, this has gone on long enough. Make an example of this bundler. The fandom demands it.
You are one of our most treasured creators. Long have you led your timeline videos, but your inability to see Dead Space 2 for what it is was a colossal failure. I will continue my series into the story instead. No, you will not. Soon the remake's launch will begin, and when it does, the weight of your heresy will cancel your channel, and you shall be left behind. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please hit the like button, comment your thoughts down below, and I look forward to hearing from you. Subscribe to join the British Alliance today by hitting that subscribe button, obviously, hitting the notification bell, and I will see all of you beautiful people on the front lines, and have a good one.